All right, time for this week's Fiscal Focus, brought to you by InfoChoice, your choice of information on Australian consumer finance. Our guest this week has been the talk of the town over the last few days, shocking the population with his bold prediction that the RBA will hike, not cut, hike the cash rate no less than 3 times this year, bringing it up to 5.1%. I'm, of course, referring to Judo Bank's Chief Economic Advisor and regular guest of the Savings Tip Jar, Warren Hogan, who's been kind enough to join us. G'day, Warren. Good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, guys. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for slicing out a bit of your day to join us, Warren. So 3 more rate rises. How did you arrive at this? And is this what you think the RBA will do, or is this what they should do?
Well, look, it's essentially what my analysis tells me they need to do. If the economy continues to play out like it looks like it has been for the last few months, the reality is we sort of got back from the summer holidays and things really looked a lot brighter. Certainly business sentiment turned from, both data and also my engagement with business people. It was a real, I think, dark moment for our economy late last year. We had a genuine slowdown. Consumers went into hibernation, but things are looking a little bit better. And so we look like we're wandering off that narrow path. The idea being that we have to keep the economy soft for an extended period to get inflation down. There's a chance that we are not remaining soft, that there is sort of something of a recovery happening. And if that continues to play out, I think that it's essentially telling us that the 4.35% cash rate isn't the right level if we want to restore price stability, that is, get inflation back down to target. So all this is an analytic that, I'm going to be racking up 30 years in January, that I have to respect my sort of models and processes. And these aren't a model. These are lots and lots of models and lots of different ways of looking at the economy. But, simplistically, you can actually just sort of say that the RBA did less than similar central banks in the US and Canada, New Zealand, the UK. They were hoping that our heavy exposure to variable rate mortgages would get the job done. And we're coming up to 2 years since they started hiking rates, and it just doesn't look like it's getting the job done. It's done a fair bit of the heavy lifting, but ultimately it looks like we may need to get that cash rate up to around 5, where these other central banks are, if we want to be confident inflation is going to go all the way down to sort of 2 to 3. That's the basic prognosis. Whether that actually results in 3 rate hikes or if 1 or 2 is enough to get the job done, I really don't know. But essentially, my reading of the tea leaves over the last 6 weeks has shifted my central case that it's more likely we'll see a couple of rate hikes in the second half of the year than, well, definitely rate cuts at any stage. But, I had them in for early next year, but I don't think that's the right way to think about it now.
So, Warren, you've been all over the news lately following your bold prediction. I've seen you on the Today Show, The Project, and plenty of column inches in the papers. So what have you made of all this reaction? I dare say many homeowners are quite relieved that you're not the governor of the RBA.
Yeah, well, if I was, I wouldn't be raising rates next week. I would certainly be talking about this, not rule anything in or out. I think that was very wise of Michelle Bullock to make that statement, because that's the reality of the situation. And look, the reaction has been because of, I think, the debate's been sort of off the mark in this country for the last 3 months, where it's all been about the timing of the rate cut like it was a done deal. And that's actually dangerous in my view, because not only doesn't it reflect the realities of you can't rule anything or anything in or out, but of course, if indeed we do go down this pathway of having to raise rates a couple of times, you've got all these people in the housing market and doing various decision making thinking that a rate cut's a done deal. The public commentary was skewed. And I think this contribution has helped to realign it. Now, that might come at a cost to me if they don't actually end up raising rates, because I'll look like, whatever people want to describe me as, and I'm sure people will. But it's the idea is I always knew that this was going to get quite a reaction, and it's about trying to get a more balanced conversation in the community.
So, Warren, with the latest inflation data, we saw it pick up a little bit on a quarterly basis to 1%. And last time you were on our podcast, you said the RBA risks being mugged by reality. Has the RBA been mugged by reality on this inflation read?
Look, no, I think it's a bit higher than they thought, and the detail is probably not that great. But I think that sort of concept of being mugged by reality was more sort of last year, because, when I was calling for a 435 cash rate, 18 months ago, I don't think the RBA were thinking they'd have to go that far, that they were dragged along. So I think what we're seeing now with this inflation is that it's looking sticky, the domestic inflation. I mean, the general read on it and the political narratives, I think, are, again, not right. The inflation falling from 8 to 4, which is obviously very welcome, but that was all the global inflation shock from the pandemic. That's just that going away. What we've got left in its wake is a domestic inflation problem, and that's what central banks have been and will continue to worry about. And that domestic inflation might have fallen from, let's call it 5.5 to 4.5, but it hasn't gone from 8 to 4. It's just come down a little bit and is obviously well above what they're trying to target. So, look, hopefully I'm wrong and that inflation will continue to ease back and we don't have further rate hikes. But at the moment, what worries me is actually the activity side of the economy. And then we've got these tax cuts coming, and that's going to give household incomes a real boost. And activity picking up now is inflation picking up down the track. That's just a basic fundamental of macroeconomics, that inflation lags the cycle. So it's actually what I'm worried about here and in the US is the fact that the actual economy is doing pretty well and what that means for inflation down the track.
So, Warren, much of the price rises in the latest inflation figures were to non-discretionary goods and services like housing, rents, health costs, education, insurance. These are things that people can't really cut back on. So can you explain to our listeners with big mortgages how hitting them with 3 more rate rises is going to slow down inflation in those areas?
Yeah, look, it's very tempting for, people generally to try and draw these lines between rates and specific prices, but it's not actually the way to think about the overall economy. The idea of an interest rate being set to the right level is to bring balance between overall supply and demand, and then that will sort its way through the economy with relative price changes. Now, some of those might be essentials that are going up and discretionary going down, but the fact of the matter is it's not about increasing rates to get rents down or electricity prices down or insurance costs down. That's just not the way it works. You see a lot of people say, how high are interest rates going to take the price of this down? And it's just not the macroeconomic framework that you think about it through. It's about making sure there's a balance in overall aggregate supply and demand in the economy. And the reality is we're operating at or through our capacity, and we need a period of soft demand to allow the capacity to catch up. Now, historically, the only way we've ever seen inflation, a severe inflation like we've had, removed from an economy is through a pretty bad recession. That's here, overseas. And we're trying to pull off this narrow path, trying to get away with removing inflation without a disruptive recession. It's never been done before. But in order to do that, you need an extended soft patch in demand. So, look, I can understand how people are drawing these lines, particularly people who don't want to see rates go up. But the reality of monetary policy is you have to get that short-term interest rate set to the right level for the conditions in the economy. And only once you've got that there can you start talking about individual issues and how, say, government policy may address it. But at this stage, yes, raising rates isn't going to specifically do anything about any of those individual prices, but what it will do is cool demand overall in the economy and reduce the ability for insurance companies or landlords or food and grocery companies to put prices up because demand's soft. They'll get a response where people won't be buying their product if they put the price up.
For sure. And what do you say to this rather loud group of mortgage holders? It seems like a lot of the sort of commentary is skewed towards this group when they're only roughly around a third of the Australian population when, inflation affects everyone. And to that point, like you've been around doing these sorts of analysis for as long as I've been alive. But how much of an effect does jawboning about rates rising or falling as opposed to actually altering the cash rate, how much of an effect does that have?
Yeah, well, I think it does. And I think actually one of the reasons that sentiment bounced and we got back from our summer holidays was the fact that a lot of people thought the last rate hike was behind us and the economy hadn't fallen into a hole. Certainly business sentiment improved and housing market sentiment improved. We know in financial markets that expectations play an absolutely central role in the price setting process. And I think it's important in the broader economy. So yeah, maybe if I'm out here talking about it and it's got people thinking twice, that actually reduces the chance of rate hikes. And maybe if the central bank governor had been a little bit more vocal, that might have given a bit more fear out there. But the reality is that it only goes so far. And we saw over this last weekend still strong outcomes in our housing markets. So the expectations channel is important, but in the end, you still got to get the actual rate level right. On your point about mortgage holders sort of taking it in the neck for the whole community, that is horrendous. We have actually gone from an unprecedented zero rate world where we had a decade worrying that inflation was too low, within 2 years to 50-year inflation shock, which no one could have anticipated. But the reality is that is the cards we've been dealt. It's nothing we can do about that. And if we don't address the problem, it's going to have implications for the whole community, not just, and for those mortgage holders, sure, another couple of rate hikes is potentially going to push some over the edge and be very difficult for most. But for those mortgage holders, if they don't raise rates when they need to, and then we get what I call the 1988 syndrome, and that is in a year's or 18 months' time, they have to jack up the cash rate by 2 percentage points because inflation's out of control and the economy is picking up steam. That will certainly be the nail in the coffin for a lot of these people. So it's all about doing as little as you have to, but getting the job done. It's balance, and it's not something we control. It is, as I said, the cards we've been dealt. And it's a bit sad. I mean, I think everyone should be cautious about how much leverage they take on, and how much debt they're willing to service. But it's absolutely almost unbelievable that we went from zero rates to 8% inflation in 2 years. And that's the reality, and we have to deal with it.
What about governments? I mean, are they making the RBA's job harder? I mean, there's a federal budget coming out in a couple of weeks, and we're actually going to send Harrison down to Canberra, lock him up with the budget papers for 7 hours. Should be fun for him. But there's arguments that changes to things like industrial relations policy are driving up construction costs, hampering housing supply, while they're also encouraging inflation matching increases to the minimum wage. Also arguments that they're distorting the energy market by subsidising intermittent renewables that seemingly hamper the economic viability of baseload power sources, and also allowing unfettered NDIS spending. So perhaps the RBA has done its job and the government isn't pulling its weight, leaving the RBA to pick up the slack.
Yeah, look, you've just listed a bunch of things where you could make that argument. My perspective on this, and I am a citizen of this country, so, I still need to be reasonably respectful of our government, but they haven't fully joined the inflation fight, which they probably needed to 2 years ago. And that would have been cutting back pretty hard and trying to run a bigger surplus. They haven't joined that fight. So you could argue that, and the various policy issues, whether it's related to industrial relations or the energy transition, could potentially be playing a role, but they probably see that as politically important. So that's their prerogative as the elected government. But they haven't been too bad in the last 18 months at not being frivolous and overspending. But the big test is coming up now. This is a pre-election budget. They've got windfalls because the economy is strong and inflationary from higher income taxes. And I hope they continue to be disciplined. I mean, the Treasurer has tried to shift the narrative earlier in the year to sort of softer growth and concerns about the global economy, which is probably sort of paving the way for more spending ahead of the election. But I think that could come back to bite them, because if I'm right that the economy is actually picking up momentum now, then if they go and throw an extra 20 billion at the economy on top of the tax cuts, then the RBA might not just do 1 or 2 rate hikes, they might end up doing 3 or 4. And that would really hurt them at the next election, if indeed it all happened before the election. So, yeah, look, the political realities of our world mean that the government was only ever going to do so much. I think they've been reasonably disciplined so far. But in the end, the RBA, my analysis, we've got a real interest rate around 0. I've got about, somewhere between 50 and 2,000 years of history that says our real interest rate needs to be around 2, if not higher. So before the government really sort of needs to panic and think about what they can do to take inflation out of the economy, the RBA's got to get their interest rate right. And I think everyone was hoping that this would take 5 years and they could do it gradually. But if the inflation isn't going to go away, or if indeed it starts to pick up again, that's a signal that no, you've got to get that real interest rate up. And it's just still too low, in my view. And the fact that the nominal rates had to increase so much is, as I said, it's a sad reality of our circumstances. And we've just got to play the cards we've been dealt.
There we go, Warren Hogan. I have no doubt this is going to play out like a Hollywood blockbuster soap opera. I'll let you get back to your next press junket, but thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us on the Savings Tip Jar podcast.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys, for having me on the show once again.